Good afternoon, Maine. This is Chuck Ellis, and this is the Muddy Waters Podcast, where we try to help you navigate through the muddy waters of Maine and American politics. And we do that largely through bringing on people who usually know a bit more than me about the topic that we're speaking about to help us understand a little bit more about what's happening. Unfortunately, the mainstream media is failing us. Fortunately, we have some great reporting by the Maine Wire. So we do have some people who are shedding some light on what's going on in our world. But we're trying to help add to the conversation by, again, bringing in people who know a little bit more about certain topics. And so today, we are blessed to have with us Joel Furrow, who is the executive director of an organization called the Cellar, and they are based out of both Lewiston and Portland. And figured we could have a fun conversation around the topic that we all like to talk about these days, which is immigration. So, how are you doing today, Joel?
Hey, Chuck. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Yeah, so immigration obviously being a hot topic, especially with everything Trump is doing and Homan and a number of things along those lines. People are very have strong opinions about it on both sides of the conversation, and just figured, one of the things that I'll let you talk about this and kind of share like your background, how you got to where you are right now, and how that relates to the topic. But you have some unique insight that I think the average Mainer doesn't have in this conversation. And so wanted to give you some opportunity to talk. So just start with like who you are, where you come from. You have to be honest about where you're from, and how you got to be where you are now.
Yeah. Thanks for outing me there. Yeah, I am from away. If Chuck wasn't clear enough there, I have this great opportunity to be part of this New England area, be part of the state of Maine. Obviously, can never lay claim to the term Mainer. So I was born in Virginia, grew up in the South, North Carolina, and West Virginia as well. But I've been up in New England for 15 years now. We've had 4 kids. I have 4 little Mainers in my house. They're all born in Maine. One day I'll die, be buried in Maine. Somebody will walk by and mistakenly say, "There's a Mainer." And that's as close as I'll get. They'll be wrong about it, obviously, but that's as close as I'll get. So we're from away, but I grew up, just to go all the way back, kind of faith is a big reason for where I kind of landed where I've landed and doing what we're doing, especially as it relates to immigrants in the state of Maine. And so my growing up in a Christian home, kind of going into different parts of the world, kind of on mission, even at a pretty young age, and kind of got exposed to various cultures. So even as young as middle school, and which was pretty formative for me. So that's a part of my background. And then in college, got a chance to spend time in the Middle East. This was in 2006, 2007, kind of height of the Iraq War. I was living in the country of Jordan, and kind of got exposed to this idea of these people that were refugees for the first time. Jordan, a small country it's about the size of Indiana, was taking in a few million Iraqi refugees, and actually had more refugees than they did citizens of the country of Jordan at the time, which was just wild to consider. And so definitely saw a lot of like what war can do, and what displaced people's kind of what it actually looks like. Came back to the United States, and ended up working in Atlanta, in a little area where it was a refugee resettlement location, and actually lived in the same housing as they did. Ended up moving to Boston. All my roommates were guys from Saudi Arabia, Palestine, and that type of thing. I spoke a little Arabic, and so we got to know each other pretty well. And worked with at-risk youth down in Boston, and then ultimately made the move to Maine. We got married. I got married and married a Mainer, and we moved back to Maine for her, and was looking for a place where I could work with teens and do some youth ministry in a lot of ways, as well as a refugee community. And obviously Lewiston became a possibility for us. The Root Cellar represented that opportunity, and been with the Root Cellar since 2012. I've been the executive director for the last 5 years, almost 5 years now. So it'll be 5 years in April. So April 1, 2020 is when I took the lead here. So I'm not sure what that makes me in terms of the April Fool or not, but yeah.
Yeah. April officially, but I think you were kind of acting in role before that, if
True,
I'm not
true.
mistaken,
Yeah,
for
yeah.
probably 6 months to a year, right?
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a transition period from their predecessor for sure.
Yeah. And so talk a little bit about, like, obviously that's, you get a little bit of your path and how you've come to working with the root cellar, but, and refugees through the years. But, I think one of the things that we've talked about, cause for those of you who don't know, I'm actually on the board for the root cellar as well. And we're here speaking about our personal lives, not about official like root cellar
Yep.
stuff. But I think understanding like what the root cellar does
Yeah.
and has historically done will help people have a little bit more context about how you've got your experience and
Right.
yeah, kind of your experiential knowledge of what people are, I guess what's going on in that world.
Yeah. So the Root Cellar it's not a bar. It's a great name for a bar, but it's this Christian mission that's existed since 1984. Started up on Munjoy Hill in the basement of a church, literally in the dirt floor of a basement of a church, had been used traditionally as a root cellar. A group of Mennonite missionaries said, hey, how can we make a space for what they called street kids? There's this, it was the second largest white ghetto was the terminology that was used at the time, and wanted to have a space for street kids, for teenagers, and then their siblings. And so the idea of the root cellar was born then and grown over the years. It's really all about, it's a neighborhood mission. So we respond to needs that are in our neighborhood. We're dedicated to this idea of loving God, loving our neighbors as ourselves, and inviting anyone who wants to join us in that effort. It's really an outpouring of local churches, people who are about the same faith, but also which means that we're welcoming to everybody. We want to meet everybody where they're at. That doesn't mean that we don't hold fast to really core beliefs of the gospel and of Jesus. It means we do. That's what kind of makes us want to engage with everybody, for sure. So it's looked different over the years as demographics have changed. In the 90s, we started serving more and more immigrants in Portland, and then specifically among the Sudanese population at the time, and then now in Lewiston as well, opened up in 2009 there. So what it looks like day in and day out, we serve about 1,100 or 1,200 individual English language learning students that are asylum seekers or refugees or immigrants at large, and as well as a large number of teens and kids. We do have some really interesting mentoring programs that give opportunities for teens to work. Well, we're all about like establishing the idea, like, what has God given us to do? What's the work that He's given us to do in this community? And we believe our neighbors, those in need, are want to work. They demonstrate that a lot. So we give them opportunities to build pathways to employment, starting with our teens and all the way up and with our adults as well. So a lot of food access. So there's hunger in our communities for sure. And so building a community around food is a big thing that we do in our neighborhood food shares. And after school mentoring, and just dedicating to being a voice in this community in our cities in Portland and Lewiston. So.
Yeah. Nice. Well, obviously, given your experience working with this population, I think there are a couple of things that are obvious, but I'll just go ahead and say them for the sake of saying them. Is that there's like most of the people who listen to the show are going to be conservative, and there's a significant amount of people within the conservative movement that are obviously upset about immigration. And so when you say words like asylum seekers, people are like being triggered.
Sure.
And like, what are you doing serving asylum seekers? But there's some other factors that kind of play in too. And I think like there's some people in America right now is actually listening to Steve Bannon, who's a leading voice in the conservative. Well, he wouldn't even call it the conservative movement. He'd say something about conservatives that is not. I'm not going to share on my podcast, but he doesn't have a lot of respect for conservatives. He says he's a nationalist populist, but that's a separate issue. But anyway, he was saying that he doesn't want any immigration. And I find like zero immigration, I think to me, just feels like a bad policy. But within the conservative movement, there's like a wide variety of people who are frustrated about inflation, about immigration, obviously because of everything that's happened over the course of the last 4 years and beyond. There was still a lot of illegal immigration during the Trump administration. He was trying to crack it down, but even going back to the Obama administration, you've had millions of people like coming in. It's estimated that maybe in the country we might have 25 million, illegal immigrants. And then here in the state of Maine, I know that we have somewhere around 75 to 100,000, immigrants, and what their status is, I'm not going to comment on. I don't know. But given that, there's there's a wide variety of where people land, and obviously I'm not in the no immigration camp, but kind of given that whole diatribe that I just went on there, I think one of the things that would be helpful is like there are a lot of assumptions that Mainers make, and conservative Mainers make about people in the immigrant population, right? And I think those, and sure. I just give you an opportunity to maybe dispel some of the myths, or at least about the immigrant population.
Sure, yeah, and this speaks generally. I mean, I don't claim to be an expert really in much of anything. 1990s basketball, I'm an expert. But outside of that, this is just trying to speak from my experience, and that's all. So, some of the things we've heard over the years, and this is before when we were just talking about, refugees primarily. And then now we have refugees and asylum seekers. And now we have refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. And then you have all these terms: illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and they all just kind of get pushed into the same conversation. And when people are having this conversation, there's not an opportunity to kind of take a layer off here and there. And it's really important. I mean, if you go back 40 years in this state's history, especially in central Maine, you start having this conversation. You're talking about French Canadians. You're talking about, and those memes are still going to Hannaford right now, like that. And so it's, I think it's really important to kind of start there. Like our cities very much are built on and for immigrants and immigrant families. And so now, like with that in mind, it's not to say that like therefore everything that's happened has been good. I come from a very conservative background. I am conservative politically, and I don't want to see illegal immigration happen either. And so that's kind of how I'm coming to this conversation. To really put my cards on the table, I went to Liberty University, so this isn't, don't want to pull any punches about kind of where I'm coming from here. But one of the things that we see people confuse a lot of times is like, they'll see a mom at Hannaford that is an immigrant. And typically, sometimes I've heard this a lot, like it's a Muslim woman, and they'll see her use maybe food stamps or use something like that, and to pay for it, and then she'll go out and get into a really nice vehicle, right? And there's like, how is she paying for that? That will anger and trigger people. And there's become this myth that they get like free cars somehow, and that's that gets out of this, and that's really, I've heard that many times. They get a free car, they get free this, they get free that, and a refugee get $900 per person per family as a one-time support structure, and sometimes there's a 90-day support where they can help with like additional help with housing and placement for 90 days. And that money, so like if you have $900 per person per family, let's say you have 5 kids and there's your mom and dad, so you're getting less than $7,000. And that's supposed to last you for they say the metric is like up to 6 months of expenses, which obviously just doesn't add up in anyone's mind. That's federal aid that they get, for sure. And
to specify, like, we're going to be clear on here because there are a number of different immigration statuses. This is for refugees. These are legally approved. Yeah. These people did not come over the southern border. They were approved by our country, and they were settled here as part of a national program. Right. Even if you don't agree with that, like these are people that did not violate the law. It's important to point out.
Absolutely, and they're people who have been vetted. Most refugees are spending at least 2 years in a refugee camp. I know women who specifically who have been in a refugee camp. They were there for 20 years before they were able to they get picked. The United States is one of the locations they could go to. They normally put it in their top 3, and it's a lottery. Even if you're vetted to the degree that you can make, you're allowed. It's still a lottery system effectively to get to the United States. So yeah, those are, it's a high, a really strenuous thing to actually end up here as a refugee. And that's specific. There's an immediate pathway to permanent residency and citizenship if you're a refugee. And so that is who those individuals are and kind of the opportunities they have. And the other thing we hear is that, they don't want to work. We drive through downtown Lewiston and we see them, we just see people not working. And many times you're actually seeing a parent at home with a number of kids, or you're seeing an older child, an older sibling that's staying home with a number of younger siblings. And we know families where, you'll have mom and dad switching off 12-hour shifts at the same place. They'll switch off 12-hour shifts, and the older sibling will watch the kids in between. Like, that's quite common. One of the things that, so this idea that they don't work, and like they're actually working in a lot of the industries that you just don't see them in. With supply centers, Walmart distribution center is a big one. They contribute heavily. Our LL Bean boots primarily are built. Those base of the boots are built in Lewiston, and there are many immigrants are the ones who actually are working there. So the other thing we'll hear is, this idea that they're getting all this free luxury housing, and so there is some that's been something that's been going around a lot. And there's like better housing in some places like Brunswick that's been made available. Right. But I've been working in downtown Lewiston for 12 years now. And, the majority of the housing that's available to anyone there is about 100 years old. They're matchbox houses in many cases. They're struggle. They're difficult places to live in all the way around. They're not luxury by any stretch. And so, so there's a lot of these myths that just if you and there's some of it's true, like, the general assistance, you're able to utilize general assistance if you're an asylum seeker, a refugee, anyone. But that's true for me. It's true for you. If we qualify for it, you and I can use it as well.
Sure.
And so,
obviously, the major difference there is that we're citizens, and it was really, those programs were really set up for people who are part of this country, not for people outside the country. So I understand where people are frustrated and upset that, like one of the problems with that program, and I think we have the state to blame for a lot of this, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things we want to make clear is that in a lot of this stuff, the primary culprit is not the people. There's blame that can be thrown around there, to be sure. Not with people who are legal refugees, right? There isn't, but with the primary blame anyway is with the government. And so, like, part of the problem with these the public assistance, I can't remember the funds, is that the 95% of them, I think, or something like that, some high percentage of them come from the state. Mm-hmm. Right. But in order to qualify for that state funding, it basically has to be unlimited to anybody who needs it. Right. And so then you have these situations where large swaths of people come to an area. And even though most of it's being paid by the state, a significant it's still creating a significant cost burden to the taxpayers. And so, like, I definitely understand where taxpayers are coming from. There was a report, like, I live in Westbrook, and we're not Portland or Lewiston, but, like, I think we're trying to become mini Portland to some degree. Hopefully not, just to be honest, but, like, and we had somebody at one of our city council meetings who was saying with the company that, like, 95% of the people of the public assistance was going to immigrants. Yeah. And so, like, that's where, that's driving up the cost for people who are already struggling. So anyway, I just want to comment on that. I think it's worth bringing into the conversation.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of layers to that too. I mean, I don't disagree about the assessment of general assistance. I've said for a while now, there needs to be some level, a significant level of general assistance reform in this state. Yeah. I'd love to see that for a variety of reasons. One of them, from the perspective of my work, is that the approach that the state has taken, or the approach that this policy is taking, which like predates our housing crisis. It predates all this stuff, right? It predates the Biden administration and the border crisis that we've experienced, the lack of any boundaries whatsoever. So it predates all that stuff. But one of the challenges it has with it is that there's effectively no limit on the number of people a city or a town are supposed to take in. And yet obviously we have a limit like on housing, so this doesn't match. So when there's no limit, we can't just build housing out of thin air in Portland or Lewiston or anywhere else. You can't just manufacture it out of anyone. And that's where you end up with, during the pandemic, we had literally thousands of people in hotels at one point. There were more than 2,000 people living in hotels, primarily from people coming from our southern border in that scenario. Like just on a humanitarian approach, first of all, and then you had the expo, obviously. So just even if you're taking a purely humanitarian approach, and I understand where your listeners are coming from, but you put themselves in a humanitarian, we want to help these people perspective, that's not helping them to say, hey, we can take you in, we can welcome you. But what we really mean is you have to stay in this hotel room and not go anywhere, because you can't go anywhere because there's nowhere for you to go, or there's no actual resources for you. We might bring you a meal every once in a while. And there were some really great organizations that we partnered with that did that. We're feeding, 600 meals a day with a partnership with another organization that was, funding it. They were using our kitchen to make it happen. There's a lot of work that went into that. But at the end of the day, there's just a capacity issue where it doesn't make sense anymore. Recently,
even in that scenario, most of the hotels that they're put up in, it's not like if they had money, for instance, to go and buy food, that they could come home and cook it. Especially, most of the hotels that they're in would not permit them to have any type of ability to cook.
There were rice cookers that were provided, Instapots that were provided. But then a hotel would say you can't have it. In it, there was in certain hotels, there was, and it wasn't like they could go to even certain situations, like a hotel where there's a pool. That was another thing. They get to just hang out in a hotel and go to the pool. No, they were literally told they couldn't go to the pool. Actually, by certain hotels, it wasn't it wasn't a solution in any stretch. It was more, it was triage, but it was triage by that with no design for stopping it, no design for actually, curbing it in any way.
Unsustainable and no plan for sustainability.
Yeah, no, none at all. And recently, you know this story. We saw, we came in contact with, I guess it was back in November? Yeah, it was in October, November.
I think it was October. Yep, just before the election. I know that.
Yep. We got a call that there were 7 families totaling over 30 people sleeping on the street outside of the Boys and Girls Club in Portland. And just that's the location. It wasn't the Boys and Girls Club said go there. It's just that's where they ended up. I went over there, and the first thing I saw a mom with her baby, nursing her baby right there. I saw dads. There were literally 7 whole family units. So I met. They had been there for 2 weeks.
I drove by as well, and I remember we had the conversation that not only, so this was in again, late October, when it was just about freezing at night, and they're living outside in tents because the government,
not even
the state of Maine, it was kind of like a tent-like situation where they tried to cover the makeshift tent. Yeah, you're right. But in that group, there were 2 newborn, newborn twins that were 2 weeks old when we discovered. Yeah, because I was part of it. Yeah,
and they had been, some of them had been in the system, meaning they had been placed in hotels, and then they were removed from the hotels because the funding ran out and placed back onto the street. And so that goes through the shelter systems into the hotels, and so you have multiple funding streams. Where in the state of Maine, typically we have a homeless community, we have an unhoused community for sure, but you don't see unhoused family units. And at that point, whatever systems that are in place, whether you like them or not, whether no matter what your political persuasion is, those systems had broken down entirely. And so that's an indicator that something's really wrong. And from my perspective, there's not enough people talking about that, saying, hey, there's this isn't working. Like what we're doing and the approach we're taking isn't working. You shouldn't have, 2-week-old twins on the street with a mom and a dad like that. And that's not to say that we should therefore like throw a ton of money at it and like go find places for everyone and their brother to live. I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying we're not approaching this from a sustainable approach. We're not approaching this from an honest approach, really, where we say,
and we're not
here's what we
approaching
can
it
do.
from and then we're not approaching it from an approach that actually cares about the
Yep.
people that we're bringing here. The care is a facade.
Yeah.
They want to look like they care. This is virtue signaling by a bunch of people on the left that don't care about the consequences of their actions, right? If they really cared, they would have also cared about the fact that there were 350,000 children that had gone missing as a result of being brought across the southern border, right? They didn't care. Trump somehow, within 6 days of being inaugurated, his team had found 80,000 of those children, which means either the Biden administration knew where they are, or they didn't care, right? And I suspect that they knew where they were, because otherwise I don't think Homan would have been able to find them that quickly, right? Like data was out there, and so like I think the point that we're highlighting here is like in addition to again, from my perspective, I won't speak from you, but being obviously against illegal immigration, against people crossing the border and applying for asylum, as opposed to following the historical legal process if you want to file for asylum, which is to go to the nearest country from your country, apply for asylum, and wait there. And then if you end up getting approved through the legal refugee process, essentially, then you're here in our country. Otherwise, you don't get to come. And the fact that a lot of people, well-intentioned as they might be, looking to come to America like generations have done in the past and try and make a life for themselves, and positively contribute to our society. If like the asylum process is only really for people who are actually at risk of being killed by their government, not people who are coming from countries that are poor, if that makes sense. And our country is poor, so we're fleeing the country because of poverty, right? That I understand it. I get why someone would want to do that, but that's not what the program is designed for.
Sure.
And America, first and foremost, has to take care of its own citizens before it can think about taking care of other countries' citizens, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I so a couple. I mean, I'm not gonna. I don't pretend to be like an expert on the border or exactly. I think there's a couple things going on. Okay, so at least the people that we see primarily are coming from a few different countries that are experiencing pretty significant political strife, and they have stories that that I have no reason not to believe those stories that they're being told, because they're coming firsthand, that demonstrate some very real political danger, persecution on some level. And one of the things we don't understand in our country is like, when a government shifts and changes, what can happen and on the ground in terms of violence. And like that doesn't happen in our country by and large. We can point to a few riots here and there or whatever, but they're not to the scale that it happens in these developing countries. And that's really, I think it's really important for us to kind of like say, like, we don't actually know what that is. So like, I don't have a parallel life experience where I can say, I know what it's like to have to leave my home country, somehow get to another continent and walk from Brazil up through the Darien Gap in Panama, all the way up to Mexico, because I think that's the best choice for my family. Like, I don't know. I don't have a parallel life experience that puts me in a situation where I think like where I would consider that to being the best option for my family. So I think it's important to have a lot of humility on this conversation. Now, your point being, like, we have legal processes, right, that have existed. And here's kind of where an analogy I would use to describe, at least as I understand, what the border policy has been, not currently. Like, we're still trying to, like, everybody's trying to figure out what it is currently, whatever, but like, and what it's going to be. And I think there's some correction happening currently, but what it has been the past 4 years, at least, has been this situation where, let's say, I tell you can't come in my house, right? And you have the front door, but I'm also going to tell you that you can come in the back door. And if you come in the back door, I'm going to give you, free reign of the house, and you can eat whatever you want to. I'll make sure that you have what you need. And there's no consequence whatsoever, but you can't come in the front door. Does that make sense? Like, so the border being the front door, we're saying like you can't cross the border illegally except through a port of entry, unless I open that front door to you, that port of entry, right? That's what our law states, like, you know, an actual law states, right? And that makes sense. We need a border, we need security, but at the same time, we've been saying if you do cross it illegally, like come around back to the back door where you keep it open, you can just come in if you want to, no big deal. And you know, all you got to do is say like, hey, I'm claiming asylum, and you can have whatever you want. Like that, the situation is that our policy as a country has included an illegal action in order to access a legal process, which is seeking asylum. And so our seeking asylum is a very legal process. Crossing the border illegally, obviously, it would be an illegal action. But seeking asylum legally can include and has included crossing illegally. And I'm trying to look at this from just like an objective, like take a step back and say, what's our policy? What have we actually been doing? I'm not saying that's a good policy. Yeah. I'm not saying that's a wise policy. It's not. You know, it's not just the families we're serving that I want us to keep serving. You know, these are people that we've gotten to know and love and care for, and they're just incredible gifts to our lives, quite literally. I mean that in a very sincere way. But there's also obviously huge security risks. The same, you know, if a great person can cross illegally, so can a person who wants to carry out illegal activities. And that's where you see situations like a Venezuelan gang taking over a condo or apartment complexes in, was it Aurora, Colorado? Yeah. And
some of them have been here in Maine too, I understand. Yeah.
Well, and there's a wide variety of other considerations, whether it's child trafficking or drug muling. There's all of that becomes a possibility. And so obviously there's been this like really horrific problem. And this is one of the things I've learned about like, you know, even terrorism, like there are more, go back to like when it was big on the war on terror and all that, there were more Muslims killed by terrorists than anybody else. Like life for life, like it wasn't, you know, you'd see these large a bombing happening, and it's other Muslims that many times were killed by a suicide bomber in these countries. It wasn't you know, necessarily other people. And so that's what happens in the scenario where you have a lot of people going after a border. The people who are going to get hurt by bad policy are the people who are actively trying to flee these situations. And so I'm not trying to paint a picture that everything is the way it should be. I'm trying to say like, hey, what it has been has created victims that absolutely include the asylum seekers that are here. You know, they've suffered greatly through the policies that have been in place, and I think that needs some real honest look at. We need to honestly look at that as we're creating new policy. We need an honest look at like what has happened. You know, who has it happened to? I understand, and I'm very sympathetic to, you know, we got a housing crisis. My property taxes have increased dramatically. I feel that. You know, I'm right there with everybody. Yeah. I'm very sympathetic to that, and I get it. I don't think what's happened is in any way wise. Our leaders have failed us miserably. Yeah. It's negligence on a scale it's difficult to comprehend. So there needs to be a correction. But I think we've got to start at least locally. You know, good leadership would say, let's take a look at who the people are that are here. What is going on? How did they get here? And like, what's a fair way to move forward with this? And some people have a lot of opinions about that we're going to disagree.
Well, it's a challenging conversation. You know, I think because it's not an abstract exercise, right? There are real people's lives that are impacted by this, no matter what you do, right? So like, for instance, I was having this conversation, I was meeting with some good friends of mine, Christians, and very conservative. But at the same time, they recognize that these are people, right? These people who have come here were, as you said, like, and one of the things that I think we found since Trump took over is that there were offices, right, in all of these South American countries and even other places where they were essentially recruiting people to come here, right? Our government was funding people to essentially encourage people to come to the United States.
Yep.
through this process, right? And so, like, this is one of those things where the government is talking out of both sides of their mouth, right? On the one hand, they haven't changed the legal process, so they're actually encouraging somebody to do something that is illegal, obviously. Because it is not legal to cross the southern border and then
Sure.
after in order to claim asylum, right? That's not part of the legal process. But at the same time, like, what is legal? And sometimes we have this conversation about, like, well, what is? I've talked about this in regards to, like, driving.
Yeah.
I had this really strong conviction that I should never speed, right? And then, over the year, and for like probably a good 5 years, I drove exactly the speed limit. I annoyed people
I don't
behind
think I
me.
have that same conviction myself, but more power
I
to you.
don't I don't anymore, by the way. But for about 5 years, I did, and
Yeah.
I annoyed the people that were in the car and the people that were behind me for that period of time. And then I kind of came to a place, that was out of obey the laws of the land kind of mentality. And then I came to the place where I was like, the law is how the law is enforced. Is kind of where I'm at now. And so it seems to me like, the police will even tell you, they'll say, they have this fun little saying internally: 9 you're fine, 10 you're mine. And so I go 9 over like clockwork. So like there is a difficulty. And I've been thinking this because I work in the bank, or I have worked in the bank. And working in the bank, you see a lot of people that are here, they have been here, this goes back 10 years, right? And they're not here legally, but at the same time they're given the authorization to work. And so it's like, as our government is giving mixed signals, like, should they be here or should they not be here? Like, we need to get this figured out and sorted and clear, because we're basically speaking out of both sides of our mouth. And to some degree, I think of this also, it kind of relates in my mind, and I'll let you go in just a second, to the student loan question, right? Like, I'm not in favor of forgiving a whole bunch of student loans, but at the same time, why do people have these student loans? Because the government pushed them to get debt that they shouldn't have got, to get a degree that they didn't need, right? And so in all of this, is not the government complicit, right? I totally
they funded
agree
guidance counselors to help you sign up for them. I mean,
right. And so with this whole conversation, we're talking about a situation where the government is actually the one who's primarily in the wrong. Yes, sure, 100%. Did people cross the border in a we'll call it less than legal way? And conservatives, feel free to comment and share about how you feel about that, the way that I phrase that. But, like, however, one of the things that maybe a lot of people here don't understand, they don't understand because, unlike you and myself more recently, you in the past, they haven't traveled and they've not lived in some of these other countries. And like the idea, like, it's a pretty regular. I've gone on the bus to in and around Uganda and Kenya. And, like, people, one of the bus companies, would literally have people that they knew couldn't legally cross the border. So they'd stop a little bit before the border. They'd have people on motorcycles pick them up and bring them, and then they'd pick them up on the other side of the border, the bus would, right? And this is a regular practice, that these types of things happen all the time in other countries. And so, like, where people are coming from, they might not even know, or they might not see it the same kind of way. Again, it doesn't make it right. If you break the law, you break the law. And if you didn't understand it, that's not still on you. But I think the context is important.
Absolutely. And so I've been thinking about this a little bit, and we're pretty used to this. You bring up speeding. Okay, you go 10 over and you get a speeding ticket. It's 10 your mind type of thing, right? Let's say you get a speeding ticket, you got to pay the fine, or maybe you're nice, you're good, you're smart, and you get an attorney to go in for you, and you pay a little less of a fine so you don't get it on your insurance record or something, right? All right, yeah, you're still paying what's due. It was an illegal action. You got caught. Fine. What about reckless driving? What about DUI? Like, we have, like, degrees of offenses and degrees of consequences already kind of built into our system. We understand this concept, right? And I think it's very fair to say that if you cross from one country's border to another country's border, through a border from one country to another, I should say, and in doing so in a way that neither country recognizes as legal, then you're doing something illegal, no doubt,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So that is what it is. But that's not the same thing as, me doing that with my family, right? Or with my 2 kids, or with my pregnant wife, which is like the common story that we hear over and over again. Or it's just as a single woman, right? Who's literally paid everything they possibly can to a guide to get them to this place because they think it's easier. Like, that's one thing. Are you doing something illegal? Yeah, sure. But now a drug cartel doing the same thing and like pushing drugs across the border, or worse, use your imagination. Like, there's varying degrees of offenses, and I think it's only fair to approach the conversation in that way and saying, okay, we have varying levels of offenses here. Like, what's a high priority? It makes no sense, in my opinion, to take government resources and go after low level, low priority, cases. Like, let's say a family crossing the border illegally, when you have active gangs in the country acting illegal, pushing drugs. Like, sure. Why are we? I wouldn't want our local police department worrying about a trespassing charge when there's a violent crime happening across the street. And
right.
and so I'm not saying that again, what's happened has been good. It hasn't been. It's been the opposite, right? It's been harmful on all levels. So, but moving forward, we have to kind of, I don't think it's helpful to have this like the illegals conversation. I don't see how that is a helpful pathway forward for anybody. And on all sides of the conversation, I think we have to kind of start with like, what is a practical approach to correcting what has happened, and what's a practical approach forward? And I got more on the moving forward, at least in Maine, what that could look like. But
yeah, well, I think it's one of those things where, I guess I don't care. I do care if you don't like what I have to say. Again, feel free, comment, send me a message. Some people do. Some people literally, I don't think they're following.
I'll give you guys something to talk about.
But
Chuck's a Kansas City fan, Chiefs
I
fan.
am not a Kansas City fan. I'm a San Francisco 49ers fan, and I am not watching the Super Bowl this Sunday. So anyway,
just wanted to get you put on blast for something else.
Yeah. No. So
big Pat Mahomes fan, Chuck Ellis.
I do like Patrick Mahomes. I will say.
Hey,
I think
you heard it here, people. You heard it. Let him have it.
Oh, if you're a Patriots fan, I'm sorry, but if Patrick Mahomes' career I'm not you, but I'm talking to the people. If you are a Patriots fan, I will say something that is offensive, and that's that if Patrick Mahomes' career continues as it has started, he will easily be remembered as being the best quarterback to ever play the game. Then we'll go into actually what we're talking about, which is, so I think like I've said this not on television, not online or anything like that, but in regards to the problem of student loans, right? Like I'm okay. We'll use that as an example to some degree. I would prefer not to do this, but if we can, when you're dealing with a problem, I don't know if you ever heard of the idea of a stream, right? So there's basically toxins are in the stream at this level, and you've got to figure out how do you fix the stream at this level. But how did they get there? Well, they got there upstream, and so you have to go upstream. The primary problem is actually upstream.
Sure.
And this problem is a problem that needs to be addressed, but it's primarily the one upstream. And so in my opinion, when you talk about student loans, and we can get into this with immigration as well, like the problem is that more and more people are still getting these student loans and are still building up huge amounts of debt in order to fund these corrupt universities that speaking to professors from these universities will say that they can't fail kids because they need to keep to the tuition numbers up, because the university would be in serious financial trouble if they didn't. So they're basically intentionally allowing kids who shouldn't graduate so that they can keep getting the government subsidized loans that the government forces banks and financial institutions to take, so that kids can get degrees that aren't worth the money that they're spending, right?
Yep.
So if you can go up and fix that problem, if you're going to tell me that you're going to fix that problem, I will agree to at least some degree of student loan forgiveness, right? And I think this bleeds into the conversation with immigration. If we can fix the immigration process, I'm okay. I think we have to think about the total impact. And you've got some ideas, I think you'd said, but we have to think about the total impact. We also have to consider the American taxpayer, the young adult in Maine who wants to be able to eventually buy a house but can't because housing prices are so high, because housing demand is so high,
Sure.
partly because we have this huge swath of illegal immigrants. You have to deal with the fact that like the government resources that aren't being spent to address the homeless and addiction crisis that we have here in the state of Maine because they're being directed to these other things. So you have somehow you've got to address all those things. And I think that it is going to include, it would need to include some deportation of the people that are here in Maine. And I think some of the conservatives would be like, deport them all. But anyway, that's another. Anyway, I'll let you kind of get into, because you said you kind of had an idea of like how you kind of address some of those things.
Well, okay, so let's start with like a age-old problem in Maine, at least from what I used to hear, is like how do you attract younger families with children to the state of Maine and to stay here? Like, how do you do that? And the reality is that you see school departments shrinking across our state. They get smaller over year by year, except for in the cities of Portland and Lewiston. And sometimes in Auburn's one of the, you see a shrinking population. You see a population getting older. Like there is a genuine opportunity that we've had, and you've seen this happen. Like people say what they want to say about Lewiston. All right, it's on the rise in a lot of ways, and now it's challenging. There's a challenging environment in a variety of areas, but it's on the rise economically in some senses. It's got an opportunity, and that has happened since you've seen a rise in immigration which is secondary, people choosing to move into Lewiston. So they weren't placed in Lewiston, but choosing to move there. You have a younger workforce that if you would actually invest it in, you could actually see them moving into industry in the central Maine area. And so I think like some of this has to do with, how do we invest in youth that we have in front of us today? Because again, you have this younger population. How do you invest here? And if we don't, you're just going to 10 years and be saying the same thing we've always said in Maine, which is just, we can't keep young people here. They always go and they leave the state. A part of that could be, work authorization for asylum seekers a lot sooner. Now you're going to hear people are going to say right now, like, well, they're going to take our jobs. Like, no, like, there's a worker shortage in this state, like not a worker surplus. That's just, it is incredibly difficult to hire anyone. And, I haven't had a burrito made correctly at Chipotle in years. And because there's never enough people working there.
Well, the argument is that they're not paying enough. That's why.
Yeah, that's crap. But that's just, I'm not an economist, but that's complete crap. There's a number of reasons why, but like there's an entitlement issue, all that stuff with like younger generations. We could talk about that too, but
there is an issue there in the younger generation. I think in Maine, not wanting to work or not being willing to do to start at the low end of the totem pole and have to work their way up. I think that is a problem. Our teenagers aren't as motivated to work because a lot of times, a lot of those types of jobs like McDonald's and stuff like that, like that's where your teenagers were. But I think part of the problem is that we're not having as many children as a society and a culture. Yep. And those children are not as interested in working.
So who's the we? Who's the we?
I haven't had any kids yet.
Right. Okay. So like,
hopefully soon.
Who is having kids?
Right.
Are these very religious, conservatively minded African immigrant communities, and they have a lot of kids. And what we have found, so the Root Cellar has a program in Lewiston called LUCREW, and it's a youth work experience program. It's a holistic approach to mentoring, where they really are looking at what role does work actually have in life, and why they were made to work, not just to like made to be a machine and paycheck, but like made to contribute. And that's how God has made us, to contribute to this community, to contribute to his kingdom. And so in that program, you have 4 different work experiences available. One of them is lawn care. So every summer we'll have a group of teens that cares for 30 to 40 different properties across Lewiston. And lawn care in July is not that much fun. It's pretty hard work. It's kind of lousy. but like actually developing work ethic with these kids, and watching them see that they get a paycheck, they get a stipend as part of the program. There's leadership development, all of wide varieties of form of that, life skill development, financial literacy is a big part of it. But watching them get that paycheck and be proud of what they've done and continue on through the entire summer. We have school year programs to go all the way through. Same thing. We're doing similar work now in Portland. It's and majority. I'm talking like 90% plus of these kids, of these teens, are from refugee or asylum seeker families. And these are this is privately funded. We don't get government funds for that particular program. It's
and in general, we don't receive a lot of government funds in general.
In general, we don't. We are sub-granted into a mentoring grant with 35 other Christian nonprofit mentoring agencies across the country through a OJJDP, which is Department of Justice program. So those are some federal funds that we get access to in a sub-grantee form, and that's it.
And it's important to note, though, that like Steve Robinson has talked about the nonprofit blob that has sprung up to basically profit off of and take advantage of all of the immigrants that are coming in. And it's important to note that we're not part of that, or the Root Cellar is not part of that.
No, I mean, and we will just serve whatever neighbors are in front of us. Right. That's just, the Leviticus talks about, serve welcome the sojourner among you as your native born, so welcome the alien, the stranger as your native born, treat them that with the same way as you treat, someone, a citizen effectively. And that's what we're trying to do. And I don't mean that to sound like immigration policy for some president to take up. I'm simply saying that's how we've chosen to follow that scripture in terms of the people that are in front of us. And should that change, like if there's no longer immigrants, they'll change who we're serving. We're going to serve the people, our neighbors, and who's in front of us. But yeah, that's the point here is that, like, going back to the work experiences for teens, like we've kind of tested that theory, and like what we found is that they genuinely want to work. They have not been showed how or given opportunity to necessarily. And so it's no longer a norm to go after work. It's kind of and I think that's being taught in a lot of ways. It's a norm to think about what you're entitled to and what you have a right to. And instead of saying, hey, so you're just a taker as opposed to a contributor. And we're flipping the script on that. And we're seeing, for us, it's like we're talking about 80 plus teenagers a year. And we would do more if we had more funding for it. So that's a note to anybody who's listening. therootcellar.org/take action. Make a gift today. I know that narrative that like teens just don't want to work. And I would just simply say, like, that's not what we're seeing. I would say this too. Yeah. On the work side of it, the kids that we see who want to work are coming from families who have a mom and a dad that are engaged in their lives. They're coming from an expectation put on them that they will go to school and succeed in school. They're coming from an expectation that they will be part of a faith community, whether it's Muslim or Christian, but a growing number of Christians, and that they're going to live in such a way that has a high value, which conservatives would recognize as traditional family values. And I've just described the mass majority of recent asylum seekers over the last 4 or 5 years into the state of Maine. That is how they approach life. And I've said this many times, a conservative Mainer has more in common with a Somali Muslim than they do a Maine Democrat in terms of how they approach values and what they value. You'd have way more in common. And I think that's what's kind of missing in this like what's missing from the conservatives that I know that I love, that I'm friends with, is that awareness, and I get why they're angry. I understand, but there's kind of this other thing that's been happening that's actually pretty interesting and pretty cool in this state, and it's worth considering. It's worth taking a look as we kind of wait, like how do we go forward from here?
Yeah, and ultimately, how we go forward here with a lot of the people who have come in, as you put it, through the back door and are seeking asylum is really something that's not up to us, but it's ultimately up to
Yeah.
the Trump administration and what they're going to do there, and we my assumption has been that he's going to have to spend, obviously, at least initially, he's going to be focused on those who are criminals. Like there are multiple things that we've heard him say. One is it's going to be the largest deportation in American history, and two, that he's going to deport the criminals, right? And like you could make an argument, right, that they broke the law and coming across the border, therefore that's who he's talking about. I suspect that most of your otherwise law-abiding people are not as big of an area of concern for him. There are other factors, as we've mentioned, the other impacts of people coming here, but I would be surprised to see them all sent home. But who knows what's going to happen? But you make a lot of really good points, and I think that people don't want to believe that we actually don't have enough people to do the jobs that are here. But this is an argument that I've been making since back in, I don't know, probably 2020, 2021. I had a client back when I was working at the bank who couldn't get enough people to work, and so had gone through this process to be able to get approved to bring people initially, from Jamaica and then El Salvador to work during like peak seasons in the service industry, because you just couldn't find Americans who were willing to do that job for that job. It was a reasonable amount of pay. Now, is it a career? No. Again, one of the things that we've lost in America is this ability to work your way up the chain. People, one of the reasons I got tired of being in management is that so many people just want to get paid like top dollar, as though they're a long-term, they want to get paid for loyalty that they don't have, for work that they haven't done, experience that they don't have, a work ethic that they don't have.
Yeah.
But they probably are going to stay with the company for like 6 months to maybe at best 2 years. And they're really not going to do a lot to contribute along the way. We have a culture problem. And that's one of the interesting things as you're talking, as much as I'm against illegal immigration, and I feel like these people should not have been encouraged to come here. And I don't think it was the best move for them to come here. I understand why they did. I do think that, there is some potential good, because one of the problems that we have in our society is a broken culture, in terms of we don't have a lot of moms and dads in the house together caring about their kids, focused on ensuring that their kids are good, productive members of society. Not that moms and dads don't try to do that, but we're doing a very poor job as a society. And like you said, a lot of these people have similar conservative values, especially when it comes to social issues, to what we do. And it's almost like it's really interesting. This is part of the problem of a welfare state, right? Is that it ends up pitting the people who are receiving welfare against the people who are paying for the welfare, instead of pitting everybody against the government.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, to go back to like conservative values are primarily that big government is bad. And so we're like, the government is doing a really great job at convincing you to be wrong, in my opinion, at the wrong people. We need to be mad at the government. They're creating this situation, and part of their plan is to have us divided and fighting about it, rather than being like, hey, what are you doing? You're messing things up. We need to get rid of you.
We talk a lot about that with our team, not like the anti-government approach, but the this idea of kind of pitting people against each other. That even happens in what we would call the the services industry, or the nonprofit, whatever Steve called it.
The blob.
Sure. And you see this in various ways, but it's this idea that we who have stuff can somehow come and fix things for the people who don't have stuff, as if we're the saviors, right? And what I've seen over the years, just time and time again, is when you sweep into an issue and you either throw money at it, or you sweep in to fix people with all the answers. No one likes that. It's belittling, and it doesn't work. You just spin your wheels at best, or you cause more harm and to the situation that's there. And and what's missing, and it's what government can't provide. It's not built to provide this. But like what's missing is relationship. It's what's missing is this idea of like being able to come alongside someone. Brennan Manning is one of my favorite authors. Christian guy, he was a priest. He failed. He was an adulterer. He was a alcoholic, but like ultimately just really truly understood the grace of God in his life because he recognized how desperately he needed God. And he had this quote that I try to just like always kind of have in the back of my head of, God loves us exactly as we are, not as we should be, because none of us are as we should be. And that idea of like, and if you put that into practical terms about in the nonprofit world or serving people or even like even in government, it's this idea that you're sitting across from someone who is, their life is completely broken. And if you approach this from like a top down model of like, I got all my stuff, figured out and you don't, I need to fix you. Or I say, hey, here's a check, go fix yourself. Which is kind of the two extremes that we see, but you don't actually get like down in like, down beside them. You don't actually get down with them, which is exactly what Jesus did, right? Which is come to be with us exactly in where we are. So like, that's what's missing. And like, again, like government's just not built to provide that. That's not what they don't do that well.
They don't do anything well, I don't think.
Well, yeah, there's that.
They're good at collecting taxes, I guess.
They are successful.
And having spent time outside of America, I will say they, despite your beliefs, you're going to disagree with me, people. They are actually good at maintaining roads, much better than in other parts of the world. They could be better, but
my road gets plowed last. That's all I know. But you're right.
But that's about all that I think the government's good at is collecting taxes and maybe the roads.
Yep.
So they're definitely not good at fostering community.
No, and I think that's where like, and a lot of, and I'm speaking directly to conservatives here, like our churches, those who are conservatives and Christians and part of local churches, like we've kind of abdicated our role there. We've kind of like taken ourselves out of the game, and we stepped back and said, almost saying like, hey, government, you can't fix it. You keep messing this up, but then we're not actually going to actively go out and try to do anything ourselves. We're going to fill that vacuum. I agree. The government's messed it up. Sure. Like, but how do we, what's our response in actually being proactive about that? And that's, I think that's where there's some pathways forward, not in necessarily government policy. I think there are some policies we could advocate for that would be helpful, but yeah, that's actually saying, hey, the government's not going to fix this. How do we go about, moving forward in a way that recognizes the innate human God-given dignity in everybody and say, let's work forward. Let's move forward together. And I know that sounds flowery to some people, but I kind of see it every day. It's not that flowery. It actually smells pretty bad most of the time. So.
Well, this gets at a point. There's 2 points that I would make here. Is like, one is like, again, the people are human beings, and just because they've done one thing wrong doesn't mean that they're awful, horrible human beings, and that we should just write them off and not care about them as human beings. So, like, this is where me as a conservative and like currently the vice chair of the Cumberland County Republican Committee, leading a podcast that's very about let's fix the immigration problem in America. When I hear that there are these, like, because this is how this situation that we described earlier came about. Like a woman that I know who's the wife of a local pastor called me frantic because she had just discovered that there were these people, including a bunch of children. She thought at that point that it was like 25 children who were by themselves. Turns out there were some parents. They were just, some of them were working or weren't there when but like we're like literally living outside because, and she's somebody who's not political, right? But she was pissed at our government about the fact that we had lured these people here and then we didn't have anywhere to place them. They were all eventually going to be approved to get housing, but there was none for them. And we had lured them here at a time where winter's approaching. This is dangerous and it's not good for people. And so like,
and that church stepped up.
They stepped up.
They stepped up and they funded places for them to stay. And several churches did. Yeah,
Yep. And that's and I kind of like got involved in the process and tried to get them in touch with a couple of people, including you, because I knew that the root cellar might have some resources to be able to assist. And you guys probably knew about it anyway, but like, it's one of those things where like there wasn't much more I could do. I was in the middle of a campaign season and I had a bunch of things to do, but like I contributed in that way, and I did so because even though I'm not in favor of illegal immigration, and I think they probably, I don't know for sure, but I think they probably came here a less than legal way. They're human beings who are there, and what we do, if you're a Christian, you should know this because of the story of the Good Samaritan, right? And you find somebody who's in a position of need, regardless of your attitude toward whether they should be there or not. Like it's your job to help them, and that's why
Yeah.
organizations that are helping people in real practical ways, regardless of where they come from. And this is something that Christians should be doing. We should be vehemently all about securing the border, fixing the legal immigration process, which takes way too long. Again, you can see pictures of me and my wife. Oh, if I can get my finger in, it's hard to point backwards. Anyway, on camera, but if you can see pictures of me and my wife, we've been waiting 16 months so far. To get her here legally, and we've still got a bit in the process to go. But we're going about it the right way. And if you want to come here the right way. And even though I'm really serious about fixing that, stopping illegal immigration, the reality is these are human beings, and I think having this like crass attitude of basically devaluing them because again, it's because of mistakes that the government made is a huge problem. So that's one thing. I think what the government should do is one thing. What we as individuals should do for people in need is another story. The government shouldn't have let them in. They did. They're here. What can we do to help? Not like the blob. What can we do to profit off of them and use them to advance our agenda? But what can we do to help actual real human beings and let the government do its job? And so the other thing that I would say is like you kind of have touched on is this comment that I've made is that like there's this idea that seems to be present among a lot of conservatives because Trump won, that like basically we're good, everything's going to be fine. Right, like he's going to take care of things, and don't get me wrong. I think a lot of, I wouldn't say everything. I never would say that I agree with everything that anybody does, but I would say probably 90 to 95% of the things that he's doing are things that I am so thankful for, and we've needed to have addressed a number of issues. Yes, I agree there are two genders, and I'm very glad for that. I'm so thankful I'm so thankful that he's withdrawing funding from the DOE if they continue to teach DEI and things that are like really more racist than not. But the reality is like fixing the actual problem. The problem is in our society. I always like to point out to people, okay, yeah, Trump won this sweeping victory, and if you sense a little bit of sarcasm in my voice, it's there, right? When you don't even get 50% of the vote, and you can argue that maybe some of that's because of some cheating, whatever. The reality that like somewhere around 70 million people voted for the worst candidate in U.S. history by far. I mean, I like that should scare you about the state of our country. Trump can do great things, and it can even move us in a positive direction. But in 4 years, where are we? And especially if you're here in the state of Maine, the reality is we here in the state of Maine don't control anything, and the Democrats control everything, and they don't really seem to care to get much input from the conservatives, and they're just going to kind of push forward with their agenda regardless of what we think about it. And we almost won the House here in Maine. We didn't. So we need people to get involved. But on top of that, the truth is this problem that we have in our society is not going to be fixed completely by policy. The policy flows from the culture. We have a culture problem in America, and we, the people, don't just need to vote, don't just need to pay attention to politics. We actually need to get more involved in our communities, get to know people, understand where they're coming from, and be able to communicate what we believe is the truth of, in terms of policy and what's the best way to move forward, conservative or whatever. But we need to restore a healthy society. And I'm sure there's some people out there that are just like, well, but the Democrats, you can't talk to them, and I think there's a truth. Like, there is a little bit of cultism in the Democrat Party, where there are people out there, and we'll see them on libs of TikTok and stuff like that, who are basically like, well, if your family voted for Trump, you should cut that person out of your life. The truth is that this happens on both sides of the aisle. Yep. There are conservatives that act the exact same way and won't engage with their. Does it happen more from the left? I will say I think it does. But the reality is, we need to be the bigger people if we actually care about our society and we want our society to survive. If we want to sit back on our haunches and judge everybody else, we can watch the world crumble and burn. But if we actually want to see our world move forward positively, we need to engage in conversation, and even in conversation with people we don't agree with.
Yeah.
Important. Yeah, I mean, that's most importantly, civil discourse.
That's one of the things I think is missing on really both sides of the political aisle. Just to take a step out of the immigration conversation for a second, but it includes this, obviously. We don't really have people of conviction leading us anymore. On either side. And that hasn't been true for a really long time. And you look back at our founding fathers and stuff, like, these were guys who were like, they had true, real conviction, and they put everything on the line for that conviction. And I don't think we're people who live out of conviction. We kind of live out of we're responsive to, we only get animated politically because we hate the other side. And that's, in sports terms, that's I like to call it, I've heard the term irrational sports hate, where you just like, you're never going to tell me anything good about Coach K. I'm never going to believe it personally. I will never believe anything good about that man whatsoever. I don't care how much proof you put in my face. I won't believe it. Yeah. I have irrational sports hate for sure.
I have the same toward Tom Brady. My brother, who's a Bills fan, has it toward Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah, and that's fine. That's fine. I like to kind of dabble. Like, it's fun because it's like it keeps me in this like child. It's boyish, right? It's fun. It's a good time. It's like takes me back to the '90s, right? And it was fun to cheer for these teams or whatever. And the same, I hate the Yankees. A-Rod's a horrible person. But it's like, that's irrational and like boyish, and like there's no maturity there. And we can't function like that as a society. Where I have friends, a lot of my colleagues, peers from other organizations that I know and that we work alongside, and we have disagreements on a number of things, a wide number of ranging things, but we have a lot of agreement over what at least some of the goals we have for what like a healthy community should look like in some senses, right? And we work together, and we disagree politically, I'm sure. I have a ton of respect for them. And, because for a lot of reasons, the primary reason is they're living out of conviction, and they're not hating on me because I have a different perspective, and nor am I them. We both know we're coming to the table in an honest way with like, hey, we're putting something on the line. We have a conviction about this. And that's just what we got to get out of that. It's genuinely what will sink us. And eventually it's just whoever has the biggest, you see this in politics, whoever has the biggest war chest wins the game. And sometimes not always. You see that. Well, in the state of Maine, it seems to be true.
State of Maine, nationally, I think it was 3-1, and Trump still won. But that was
yeah. I mean, he's an enigma in so many ways. But I'm just simply saying, like, that's not a game where anyone wins, and is what I'm saying. And I think we're just kind of rudderless all over the place. Unfortunately, we're rudderless in these muddy waters, Chuck. So steer us, please, sir.
That's the goal. It's to help add to the conversation. And at this point, I've had a libertarian on, and actually probably a number of libertarians, nobody necessarily officially outside of the guy who is from the Libertarian Party. I tried to get somebody from the Green Party on, but that apparently might be a lost cause, because she wanted me to agree on climate change, transgenderism, and a number of other things. in order to be able to even be able to have conversation. And I was like, yeah, okay, well, I guess this is, but I want to find people that
Disagreements
we
are
can
more
have
fun.
I think having a good conversation, if we could at least find some
Yeah.
areas, I think she wouldn't come on the podcast unless I agreed with her on all those things. I would have been okay having her come on the podcast and talking about the areas where we had agreement, but we just couldn't. We couldn't do that, so unfortunately. But anyway, yeah. So it's been a great conversation, Joel. I just want to thank you for coming on. And yeah, any last words before we pieces of advice for people outside of to give to the root cellar?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of the larger conversation with immigrants, I would genuinely encourage you to try to get to know some. It's not hard. It's actually quite easy. And I would just encourage, for those who are like, I don't want to, I've got my opinion figured out, all that stuff. Like, I would just straight up say, like, that's lazy. It's a lazy approach to a really critical issue. Holding a really hot opinion about a group of people is a simple and easy thing to do. Holding that really hot opinion while knowing them, like, and actually living in that tension, like, that's real work. That's going to take some, like, courage and it's going to take, and it's the right way to approach this. Like, to put it in political terms, we've seen the other side really kind of like project all of conservatives as one thing and demonize them in so many ways. And like, and just, but if you actually had a conversation with someone about, actually have a conversation with someone who supported Trump, have you done that? And they're like, no, they're all in a bubble. Like, don't be that. Don't do that. Like, get out of the bubble and actually have a conversation. I welcome you to come down to the Root Cellar. We'd love to have you. We need help. If you can speak English and understand the words that are coming out of my mouth, we need your help in our English program. We'd love to have you. You'd be welcome there. Yeah, that's all that to say. So therootcellar.org, and would love to meet you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Joel. Again, great contribution to a less than easy topic, especially among conservatives. But again, a lot of the critique is of the liberals who supposedly, care about people, but bring people here regardless of the conditions that they're bringing them into, and don't seem to care about the consequences there. So, again, great conversation. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back, if I can remember correctly, on Thursday. And we're going to have somebody who has started up, Christina Parker, I think, if I'm correct, who has started a chapter of Turning Point. Charlie Kirk, he's founded Turning Point USA. So she has started, her with the help of another one of her friends, which is Turning Point is a group of younger adults who largely, some of them maybe going to college, but a lot of them are pre-college or not going to go to college, who care about conservative politics and are trying to find ways to turn Maine red. So if you have time, make sure to be with us on Thursday. All right. And I'm out.
See you, Chuck.